Congratulations! You've now reached phase 3 of the speech writing process. The final step is the conclusion. Let's end with a bang. Remember that the ending of your speech is your moment to do the best mic drop possible. So you want to be memorable. There are two components that make up the conclusion of a speech. The first component is a summary of the main points, and the second component is the concluding statement. The first component of the conclusion is the summary of main points. This is where you remind the audience of the main takeaways from the speech one last time. I tell my students that typically the summary sounds very similar to the preview of main points from the introduction, and that preview of main points sounds very similar to the central idea. I had a speech professor once tell me that in a speech, you want to first tell them what you're going to tell them in the introduction, and in the body, you tell them what you want them to know, and in the summary, you tell them what you already told them. Remember, repetition is key. From the audience perspective, they're thinking, oh no, did I miss something? What is the speech about again? And lastly, what should I have written in my notes? That's what you're going to get with the summary of main points. You want to make sure you're nice and brief in giving those 2 to 5 main points one last time. As I mentioned in the audience perspective, they're thinking, oh gosh, what if I missed anything? This is the time to remember. So really what you need to do is briefly and specifically review all 2 to 5 main points of the speech. You may start the summary with something like, today I shared with you 1, 2, and 3 main points. Or maybe even something like, before we go, I want to remind you of 1, 2, and 3 main point. However you like to start off the summary, that is the cue to the audience that you're not going to give any new information, but instead you're going to remind them of what they've already heard. The second component of the summary is your concluding statement. The concluding statement is where you creatively let the audience know the speech is over. From the audience perspective, they're waiting for you to know, when should I clap? Or also, how do I feel about this speech? For the concluding statement, things that work well are just like the introduction, using a startling statistic, a quote, or a story, maybe even a sound, a movement, or a riddle. I like to tell students that this is really the bookend of the speech. In the introduction, you may start with one of these things, and in the conclusion, you end with one of these. It's a great way of kind of wrapping up the entire speech into a nice package. What I don't want you to do is say thank you, or any version of thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for whatever it is. A thank you at the end of the speech is really basic, and we're not basic. Also, please do not trail off. The audience wants to know when the speech is over so they can clap for you. If you just kind of trail off and start talking and just kind of go into nothing, it's really awkward for the audience. We don't know what to do if we clap or stop or whatever it is. And lastly, please don't apologize for any errors. Most likely, if you made errors in your speech, the audience does not know. So don't point them out. Instead, end the speech with the statistic, the quote, the story, the sound, the movement, or riddle, and then be done with it. As I mentioned earlier, the conclusion is just 2 components, and it's brief. So here are some delivery tips. 1, be creative. Much like the introduction, The conclusion of the speech is your last chance to make an impression on your audience. So be creative about how you end it. Second, use a lot of eye contact. You want to make that lasting impression on your audience, so you want to be able to look out on your audience, or in our case, possibly look into a camera for that last moment. Third, be brief. The majority of the time in your speech should be spent on the body of the speech. So the introduction and the conclusion are very brief, the conclusion being even more brief than the introduction. So make sure it's not a long, drawn-out process. Fourth, memorize most of your conclusion. You're going to be exhausted mentally by the end of your speech, and you want to make sure you get a chance to memorize what you're going to say at the end, so your body and your mind know you're coming to the conclusion of the experience. And fifth, practice using pauses, gestures, and vocal changes that allow the audience to know that the speech is winding up and that you're going to want them to clap at the end. And finally, just a reminder, please do not say thank you, or that's the end, or any questions for me? Just end your speech with the dramatic closing, something that's memorable, and then be done with it. Congratulations! You've now finished phase 3 of the speech writing process, which is the conclusion. You've spent time here learning about why it's important to summarize your main points, and then also using a concluding statement that lets the audience know that the speech is over and giving that last impression. Remember, end with a bang. You've got this.